listening to the Fighting Families podcast with Preston Cave. We are in a spiritual battle, and we have a real enemy. That enemy is not our family. It's the goal of this podcast to help you fight for the family. And now, welcome your host, the Mission and Discipleship Coordinator for TBM, Preston Cave.
Hello, and welcome to the first ever episode of the Fighting Families podcast with TBM. My name is Preston Cave, and I will be your host. And most of the time, whenever we have a podcast like this, it won't just be me. I'm usually going to be either Zoom interviewing somebody, or I will be on the field somewhere in Texas or in the nation or around the world, maybe in the future. I don't know. But I will hopefully be able to have interview conversations with people. And that's the way the typical Fighting Families podcast is going to go. There may be a few times it's just me, but hopefully not, for your sake. But this episode is special because this is episode number 1. And in this episode, I thought the very first thing we need to do more than anything else is try to explain what we're trying to do with the Fighting Families podcast and really what Fighting Families is all about. You see, TBM stands for Texas Baptist Men, but we're more than just Texas. We're more than just Baptist, and we're more than just men. So we've called ourselves TBM, but really Fighting Families and the Fighting Families podcast is a ministry, a new ministry under the discipleship department of TBM. TBM is a mission sending organization. Now, we do a lot more than just send people. We do missions and we do work all around the world. And God has really blessed TBM since 1967. But TBM understands this: missions should be our greatest discipleship tool out there. A lot of times we sit people in a classroom and we teach them Bible literacy and we call it discipleship. Well, at TBM, we don't believe that that's accurate. We don't believe that the discipleship is Bible literacy, or better said, we don't believe that Bible literacy is discipleship. Now, we believe that discipleship will include Bible literacy, but we don't believe that Bible literacy in and of itself equals discipleship. When you look at Jesus and how he did discipleship, when he discipled his apostles, his disciples, he never set them in a classroom and lectured them. He took them out on the field. So at TBM, what we believe that missions is the greatest opportunity for discipleship. So I'm going to encourage you real quick before we even dive into what the Fighting Families podcast is going to be about. I want to encourage you to get involved in what TBM is doing around the world, because if you are stagnant in your relationship with Jesus, get your hands and knees dirty doing the work of God. And I promise you, you will see some incredible things as we involve ourselves in the kingdom work of God. That's the greatest discipleship opportunity that's out there. So get involved with what we are doing at TBM. You can check us out at tbmtx.org. That's tbmtx.org. And you can check out all the great things that we do all year long around the world. Well, let's dive into the Fighting Families podcast and what we're really going to be doing with these particular podcasts. Now, it's our goal. I've got it printed out because I want to make sure that we're organized and I'm not wasting your time. But the Fighting Families podcast has a purpose, and the purpose is it's our goal to resource and equip the family and the church in order to change the world. I truly believe that if we will apply the message that I'm about to share today and the messages through conversations that we have throughout the year or however long this podcast lasts, I believe if we apply this to our lives and to others, then we could literally change the world. I truly believe that. Otherwise, there's no reason for you to even listen any further. You can just turn it off. But I think that we could literally change the world. And what the goal of TBM and the goal of the Fighting Families podcast is to resource and equip the family and the church. Those are the two institutions that God has established. He established the family, and at the beginning, Genesis chapter 2, verse 24. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become echad, one flesh, that plural, one. And then Deuteronomy 6, obviously. But then you look in the New Testament in Acts chapter 2, that's where God established the church. So God established the family and God established the church. So it's our goal at TBM, it's our goal at the Fighting Families podcast to resource and equip both the family and the church. Now, there are three passages, or there's really two passages of scriptures that I want to look at in this particular episode to help you to understand what we're trying to do. When we say Fighting Families, why did we even choose that name? Well, I'll explain that in a moment. But first, let's look at Ephesians chapter 6. And I've got my hard copy Bible because I'm old school and I like that. But I'll probably throw it up on the screen for you. But here is Ephesians chapter 6, verse 10 and on. And this is what it says. Finally, be strong in the Lord and in his mighty power. Put on the full armor of God so that you can take your stand against the devil's schemes. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. Therefore, put on the full armor of God so that when the day of evil comes, you may be able to stand your ground, and after you have done everything, to stand. In this passage, we recognize that we truly are in a spiritual battle. You may be experiencing some really random attacks right now, and it's easy for us in the human realm to look at others in the human realm and say, that person is my enemy. That person did something bad to me, so therefore that person is my enemy. But here's the truth. You and I are in a spiritual battle. So the goal of fighting families is first and foremost to help us to become people who fight. Start fighting, get involved in the fight. A lot of times we try not to fight. We think that holding peace is the most important thing. And when it comes to others around us, I think that it is for the most part. But when it comes to Satan, it comes to the spiritual forces that are against us, especially as us as Christians, then we need to get in the fight. There's no peace that comes from that. And you need to recognize that, especially those of us who are Christians, we have a spiritual target on our back and on our chest, and Satan would love nothing more than to destroy us. Okay. And so we need to first and foremost recognize that there is a spiritual battle. We are in a fight, and the goal is not to not fight, but the goal is to discover who we should be fighting against. Ephesians chapter 6, verse 12. For our struggle is not against the flesh and blood, but it is against the powers, the authorities, against those of the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realm. So it's not a matter of if we fight, it's a matter of who we fight and when and how we fight. So we have a real enemy, and it is the goal of fighting families to help us to all to recognize that our family is not our enemy. A lot of times when it comes to family, especially, we think it's our spouse, or we think it's our kids, or we think it's our parents. Like, gosh, they're just doing these things against us, and we feel like they are the enemy. So therefore, we fight with our families. Now, here's a phrase that fighting families is going to throw out there from time to time, and this is the phrase: "My family fights." My family fights. All families fight, really. But we're even going to make a t-shirt. My family fights. Fightingfamilies.com. But here's the deal. Um, my family fights. Your family fights. It's not a matter of if we fight. It's a matter of who we fight. Stop fighting against the family and start fighting for your family. That's the goal of the Fighting Families podcast. And I believe that if we will apply this to our lives, where we'll recognize that we need to be people who fight, individuals, people who fight for the good fight. Paul said at one time, he said, I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. Well, when he was talking about that, he wasn't saying that I've fought a good fight. No, what he was saying is I chose the right fight to fight. And so there are a lot of people out there who are really good at physical fighting. They're really good fighters, but they're fighting the wrong fight. Don't fight the wrong fight, you see. So as individuals, let's make sure that we first and foremost fight the right fight individually. Number two, we become a family that fights the right fight. Now let's look at Nehemiah chapter 4. I should have turned there before I started this podcast, but I didn't. So you're going to have to bear with me for a second. But Nehemiah chapter 4, we see a couple things. We're going to stay here for the rest of the time, but we see a couple things in this particular passage. First and foremost, we see a couple characters, Sanballat and Tobias. And these guys are terrible enemies or Tobiah, sorry. So Sanballat and Tobiah are both enemies to the Jews. The Jews, if you know the story, Nehemiah goes to Jerusalem. He finds it in rubbles, and he says, gosh, I've got to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. And so he begins to do so. And we see in chapter 4 of Nehemiah that Sanballat and Tobiah are trying to verbally attack the Jews and verbally attack Nehemiah and say, hey, don't worry about, are you going to really rebuild these walls? Animals could jump up over these walls. That's not impressive. And there's no point in you even doing the work. Well, Nehemiah wanted to make sure that they did not encourage the people to stop working. So Nehemiah, in I guess verse 13, this is what Nehemiah says. He calls everybody together and says, Nehemiah said, therefore, I stationed some of the people behind the lowest points of the wall at the exposed places, posting them by families, with their swords, their spears, their bows. After I looked things over, I stood up and I said to the nobles, to the officials, and to the rest of the people, and this is what Nehemiah says, and this is point number 2 with fighting families. Point number 1, become a person who fights. Point number 2, become a family who fights. Look at this. After I looked things over and I stood up and I said to the nobles, the officials, and to the rest of the people, don't be afraid of them. Remember the Lord, who is great and awesome, and fight for your brothers, your sons, and your daughters, your wives, and your homes. Nehemiah understood something that we often forget. Check this out. Nehemiah recognized that if he could get the people to fight with and for their family, they would be less likely to retreat when they saw the enemy coming. Check this out. Now, could you imagine you're at the walls and the weak places, and you see the enemy coming, and you say, "Oh my gosh, they are bigger than we are. There's more of them than there are of us." When you would see them coming, chances are you're tempted to turn tail and run, aren't you? But watch this. Whenever you get ready to turn tail and run, Nehemiah understood if he could make dad have to look his son or daughter or his wife in the eyes before he ran, that would make dad less likely to run. If he could get the child before the child turned and ran, if he could get the child to see mom in need, to see dad, to see brother or sister in need, then they would be more willing to fight. Now, what if we not only became people who fought, but we became families who fought, and we began to fight for the family? Stop fighting against the family, start fighting for the family. Let me give you a quick picture. Here's a pen. Let's pretend like this pen is a sword, okay? I've got this sword, and I am ready to attack you. I'm ready to attack you. Now, I want you to see something for a second. You got to look at this screen if you're driving. So pull over and look. This is a sword, and I am ready to attack you. I am in attack mode. I am in fight mode. What am I attacking? You. What am I protecting? Whatever's behind me, right? Whatever is behind me. So if I am a family member and I am fighting against my family, the only thing behind me is the enemy, the true enemy, which is Satan. So that means not only am I attacking my family, but I am protecting Satan. I am protecting the real enemy. So the goal of Fighting Families and the Fighting Families podcast is to turn our attention to the right enemy so that we are not only attacking the right enemy, but we are protecting the right people. When we attacked the real enemy, Satan and the spiritual forces in the heavenly realms, when we are in the spiritual battle and attacking the right enemy, we are protecting the right people, our families. Okay. So, first and foremost, become a person who fights. Secondly, become a family who fights. And then this next point is it could literally change the world if churches would apply this to their ministries. Check it out. A little bit later in chapter 4, we see that everything was good so far. Okay. But there was this conspiracy for Sanballat and Tobiah to actually come over and physically attack. Um, and so what it says in verse 16, let's do that. From that day on, half of the men did their work, while the other half were equipped with spears, shields, bows, and armor. The officers posted themselves behind all the people of Judah who were building the wall. Those who carried materials did their work with one hand and held a weapon in the other hand. So they continued to do the work, but they were prepared. Um, and then in verse 18, and each of the builders wore his sword at his side as he worked. But the man who sounded the trumpet stayed with Nehemiah. The person who sounded the trumpet stayed with Nehemiah. And Nehemiah recognized, okay, now we've got families that are fighting for each other, but we are still too spread out in this area. and the attacks could still come. The enemy, we are still vulnerable to the attack. So it's not enough for me just to be an individual who fights. It's not enough for me just to be a family who fights. I need other families to fight for me. So watch this. This is what Nehemiah does. In chapter 4, verse 19, Nehemiah's got the guy who blows the trumpet. He's got that person. So Nehemiah said to the nobles, the officials, and to the rest of the people, the work is extensive and spread out, and we are widely separated from each other along the wall. Wherever you hear the sound of the trumpet, join us there. Our God will fight for us. What Nehemiah did was he recognized that, okay, now we're fighting. We have a bunch of individuals who are fighting. We have a bunch of families who are fighting, but we're still vulnerable. Each individual family is vulnerable unless other families fight. So Nehemiah said this, okay, become a person who fights, become a family who fights, and thirdly, and most importantly, become a family who fights for other fighting families. Become a family who fights for other fighting families. Nehemiah said, if you hear me blow the trumpet over in this area, all of you other families that are fighting, run to the fight and fight for this other fighting family, because that trumpet sound, the blowing of the trumpet, is an indication that the enemy is attacking a family. And if all the other families would run to the aid of that one family that's under attack, then not only would that family be strengthened and protected, but the entire community would be strengthened and protected. Now, this is where the world could change. What if churches, pastors, I'm talking to you now, deacons, spiritual leaders in the church, elders, talking to you, what if the church caught a vision that they were to equip the family, to strengthen the family individually, but to encourage all the families to begin to fight for the family? You know, it's funny. Not only do we as individuals tend to fight against our family, when we look at the church, families tend to attack and fight against other families. Isn't that interesting? Now, going back to this illustration of the pen being a sword, if I'm a family and we have families in the church that are fighting against other families of the church, what is that doing? I'm fighting against you. You're not my real enemy. Who am I protecting? Satan. So when we are in church, think about this. If we are in church and we have a disagreement or a butting of heads and we're fighting against another family in the church, we are protecting the enemy. And Satan loves it because he wants families to turn on each other. But what God wants is for families to turn towards each other and to fight for each other. So not only become a person who fights, not only become a family who fights for the family, but become a family who fights for other fighting families. And I promise you that this could change the world. Now, I share all of that just so you get a glimpse into the vision and the motivations behind Fighting Families, behind TBM, and what we're trying to do with this Fighting Families podcast. So here are the objectives that I'm going to lay out for us in these Fighting Family podcasts. And then, in about a year or so, we'll evaluate and see if we actually met some of these objectives. Okay. But objective number one, encourage individuals to recognize and engage in the fight and resource and equip the individual. Number two, encourage families to become fighting families and resource and equip the family. And then number three, encourage fighting families to fight for other fighting families. Therefore, resource and equip the church. That is the goal of the Fighting Families ministry with TBM. And that's also the goal of these Fighting Family podcasts. Now, the hope is that we will be able to upload a new episode each week. I don't know what the day is yet, but each week we're going to try to upload a new episode that has different topics on it that are useful to the family or that are useful to men or individuals. Okay. And hopefully we'll have individuals. I've already got several individuals that we've already recorded. They're great. You're going to love them. And the goal is to invite others on the show to be able to ask them questions. Say, hey, how do you deal with this? How do my family's struggling here, so how do you deal with that? And the goal is that this is going to be a huge resource to help you to become a better person who fights and gets engaged in the spiritual battle. to not be ignorant of the spiritual battle, to know who the real enemy is. So to be a person who fights, to strengthen your family and become a family who fights, and to help your church become a family, a group of families who fight for other families. Man, I am excited about what God is going to do with these Fighting Families podcasts. What I want you to do now is to pray about subscribing to this channel and sharing this all over social media so that more people can be aware of what we're trying to do with these Fighting Families podcasts. Help us get the word out with Fighting Families. God bless you, and we are praying for you day in and day out. We love you.
You have been listening to the Fighting Families podcast with Preston Cave. Be sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new episodes each week. If you like today's program, we want to encourage you to share it with your friends and family members. To learn more about the resources we have to offer, visit us at www.fightingfamilies.com. Until next time, be sure you fight for your family today.